Hi, welcome to part two on our lecture on prehistory. We're going to be looking at some additional artifacts. In this particular case, we're going to be looking at some cave painting. We're going to be traveling to France, and we're going to be looking at the very famous cave of Glasgow. Um, so something to think about in our last lecture, we talked about this idea of symbolic thought and why that people from very early on in the development of the human race, had this ability to have symbolic thought, enough at least to sort of draw a picture onto a rock or to a cave. Um, and so we are as likely to communicate using easily interpretable pictures as we are text. So again, remember prehistory is before the written record. Portable handheld devices enable us to tell others via social media what we are doing and thinking. So you kind of want to think about, um, these cave paintings as maybe a form of text. Approximately 15,000 years ago, they communicated with pictures, sort of like how we communicate with those um, emojicons or whatever. So, it's this idea of communication, but with no written language. So the Cave of Glasgow, France, is one of almost 350 similar sites that are known to exist. Most of these sites are isolated to a region in southern France and northern Spain. Both the Neanderthals, named after the site in which their bones were first discovered, the Neander Valley in Germany, and modern humans, early Homo sapiens, coexisted in this region about 30,000 years ago. So you have to also think about the lifestyle. Life was very short, very difficult. Resources were scarce. The climate was unpredictable. It could get very hot. It could be very, very cold. And again, these people were migratory and nomadic. Example of one of the cave paintings that we're going to be looking at. So again, this was done about 15,000 years ago. And here we have these, modern humans at the time. They're living and witnessing migratory patterns of a vast array of wildlife. And they were hunters and gatherers. Um, and so this cave was actually discovered in 1940, and it was really a big deal because prior to this, in terms of prehistorical art, people didn't think that humans could, during that time would have been able to create something like this. And if you look at it, it actually looks very expressive. It sort of reminds me of Chagall, who is a very famous 20th century painter, and it has a very expressionistic quality. It's done by the Chagall, the painter I was talking about. And obviously this is more developed, but I definitely think you get a sense of sort of, this isn't done in a realistic style. It's much more expressionistic. So looking back at this is called the Great Hall of Bulls, located in the cave of Glasgow, and I think it has a very expressionistic quality. I mean, they're certainly recognizable. We sort of see them as some sort of bovine or some sort of antelope or horned creature, and here it looks like they're deer. And so prior to this discovery, people didn't think that humans during this time period could communicate in this way. This image, these early artists used charcoal and ochre. Again, ochre is a kind of pigmented earthen material that is soft and can be mixed with liquid and comes in a range of colors like brown, red, yellow, and white. We can find images of horses, deer, bison, elk, and a few lions, rhinoceros, and a bear, almost an encyclopedia of the area's largest prehistoric wildlife. Among these images are abstract marks, dots, and lines in a variety of configurations. In one image, a humanoid figure plays a mysterious role. So there were some human figures depicted. So this is one that is you need to know. This is the one that the AP College Board, this image has selected. So on September 12th, 1940, the entrance to the Glasgow Cave was discovered by an 18-year-old Marcel Ravadet, and um, and he returned to the scene with three of his friends. And again, they kind of made this discovery. So it wasn't actually discovered by archaeologists. Somebody stumbled upon it. Um, so this is another view. So this is a vocabulary term I want you to be aware of. These animals are rendered in what has come to be called twisted perspective, okay, in which their bodies are depicted in profile while we see the horns from a more frontal viewpoint. So remember when we were talking about, some of the, remember we were looking at some of the earlier work in our class discussions and talking about what makes art and what constitutes art and trying to figure out, who's the most important person in certain works of art. um, this idea of content and the arrangement. It's similar. There's this thing called composite view with Egyptian art where figures, are frontal, but their heads in profile. So it's sort of the same thing with animals, except it's called twisted perspective. These images are sometimes entirely linear, drawn to define the animal's contours. In many other cases, the animals are described in solid and blended colors, blown by mouth onto the wall. And so, literally, what they would do is they would have some sort of like a pipe, or some sort of hollowed out vine or something, and they would actually fill up um, the straw, sort of like a straw, and then blow paint onto the surface and sort of create these images. I think there's actually a diagram or some mention of it in your textbook. So, the large scale of many of the animal images, we can presume that the artists worked deliberately, carefully plotting out a particular form before completing outlines and adding color. Some researchers believe that master artists enlisted the help of assistants who mixed pigments and held animal fat lamps. This is They would burn animal fat because obviously, you go into a cave, there's no electricity, and so this was a way to illuminate the space. Alternatively, in the case of these sort of rooms or these caves containing mostly engraved and overlapping forms, it seems that the pure process of drawing and repetitive redrawing held serious and again perhaps ritual significance to the maker. So this idea that they're not just only recording the wildlife that was going on during this period, but obviously someone took the time to go into this dark cave, to illuminate it and to draw these animals and really draw them in a very expressive way that definitely shows a sense of sophistication and planning. And so again, this, with a lot of prehistoric art, we're assuming that it has a ritual, the act of drawing and going into this sacred sort of place, and maybe people would come visit, had this sort of ritual um, um, idea associated with it. So here's another image that you can see here. This one's a little bit more different. It's definitely much more linear. There's not a lot of color, but you definitely can recognize that this is some sort of bison. There's some sort of human figure that has a bird head, and then also this kind of bird that looks like it's on a pedestal. So um, anyway, so why, we talked a little bit about why, prehistoric people painted and engraved the walls at Glasgow and other caves like it. Perhaps the most famous theory was put forth by a priest named Henry Bruel. He spent a considerable amount of time in many of the caves, and he actually recorded the images and drawings um, when the paintings were too challenging to photograph. Burrell believed that the images played a role in hunting magic. The theory suggests that the prehistoric people who used the caves may have believed that a way to overpower their prey involved creating images of it during rituals designed to ensure a successful hunt. This seems plausible when we remember that survival was entirely dependent on successful foraging and hunting. Um, and it is important also to remember how little we actually know about these people. So again, these are theories. we're not exactly sure. But when you are called upon to speculate, or when I am testing you on these images, these theories are things that you should be able to, you should be able to talk about in a discussion or write about in an essay. So another theory suggests that the images communicate narratives, stories. While a number of the depictions can be seen to do this, one particular image in Glasgow more directly supports this theory. And this, we're looking at it, a bison drawn in strong black lines, bristles with energy as the fur on its back of its neck is sort of raised. So again, it's very expressionistic. So they're thinking that this is fur, and it's, how a dog, when it gets kind of scared or pissed off, and the fur kind of goes up. It's very similar. Um, and it's radically turned to face us. So again, it's this twisted perspective. It's profile, but the face and the horns are frontal. Form drawn under the bison's abdomen, this is what they're talking about here, is interpreted as internal organs spilling out from a wound. A more crudely drawn form positioned below and to the left of the bison may represent a humanoid figure. Remember, a humanoid figure is a combination of an animal and a human with the head of a bird. And nearby, a thin line is topped with another bird, and there is also an arrow with barbs right here. So interpreters of this image tend to agree that some sort of interaction has taken place among these animals and the humanoid figure, in which the bison has sustained injury either from a weapon or from a horn of the. They say there's a rhinoceros in the picture somewhere, but I think I have this slide cropped so we don't see it. But apparently somewhere else, probably outside of the frame is a depiction of a rhinoceros, and maybe the rhinoceros has wounded the bison. And why the person in the image has the rudimentary head of a bird and why a bird form sits atop a stick very close to him is a mystery. Some suggest that the person is a shaman, a kind of priest or healer with powers involving the ability to communicate with spirits of other worlds. Regardless, it's a very riveting image to depict action and reaction. Although, a lot of these aspects are still ambiguous and we're not quite sure how to piece them together. But again, using that paradigm of art historical analysis that I, talked to you, you could definitely apply that method, and I think you would come away with sort of a similar, contextual analysis of what this image is. So here's another cave, a section of the Great Hall of Bulls. And you see how the animals are overlapping, and they seem sometimes to be drawn over top of each other. So there is some suggestion that maybe artists would come back and draw over the animals. It definitely gives a sense of illusion, although I'm not sure if they knew that and that's what they were going for. But certainly you can speculate that. So you kind of visit this site. It's actually a replica. So when you look at these images, or if you actually go to Glasgow, France, and go to the site, um, it the original was opened in 1983, um, but then they shut it down because too much damage was happening with people, going in and out of the cave. Um, and so this has been a replica that's been installed so that viewers may view the painted scenes without harming the originals. Although, I don't know, I'd kind of rather see the real thing, but whatever. The cave contains nearly 2,000 figures, which can be grouped into three main categories. So animals, human figures, and some abstract signs. Painting contains no images of the surrounding landscape or the vegetation. So we do sort of, well, I mean, I think that's a deer. Um, So most of the major images have been painted onto the walls using mineral pigments, again, ochre, charcoal, and then also there's a combination of where there might be some incised lines. So some of these look like they're incised or have been engraved actually or carved into the stone. So again, you have some vocabulary. The term incised, when you hear me say that, means like somebody tool and sort of carved into a surface in size so that it leaves an indentation. So that is a term that you should get used to and be able to use. Over 900 animals, or over 900 of the images in the cave can be identified as animals, and then 605 of these have been precisely identified, meaning that they can actually know what type of animals these are. So there's equines, there's stags that are represented. There's feline sort of creatures, obviously birds. We talked about bears, rhinoceroses. We talked about bison and cattle, and obviously humans. And so this is the most famous section of the cave, and it's referred to as the Great Hall of Bulls. So if I were to quiz you on this on a test, you know, part of um, part of what you have to know is not only the image, but you have to know the title. So if I asked you the title, you would say the Great Hall of Bulls. Um, and you might be able to add the cave paintings at Glasgow. And you have to know the date to a certain degree within a certain range. You also have to know the artist when we get to that point. Usually with ancient art, prehistorical and ancient art, we don't know who the artist was, so you don't have to worry about that. But the title is really important. You can't just say, if I ask you on a test, you know, to ID this, like I might show this picture and I'll say, okay, ID this picture. You're expected to know the Great Hall of Bulls. You can't say bulls, you know, and then again, because this is global prehistory, we do need to identify the location, France, or Europe, and then the date within some degree of accuracy. I mentioned earlier about the overlapping nature of the animals, again suggesting that these paintings were a continuous effort, possibly involving more than one person. This meant that people were beginning to settle enough to keep returning to a certain area enough to paint them, and that those people that those people sort of kept together in groups. The subject choice of animals, however, shows people at the time were still very much impacted by the natural world, and their food source, obviously, a lot of it came from hunting. In a very unique way, the figures in these caves were painted in such a way they utilized the already existing shape of the cave walls as well. So I don't know if you can see here, but you know these cave walls sort of protrude out. It's not like a flat surface. So some speculate that these prehistoric artists might have utilized these projections to sort of make it look like the figure was projecting out and give more of a sense of illusion. But definitely in some of the images, you can definitely see that they actually drew. It was intentional. You know that they drew a certain figure and were trying to use the bulging part of the wall and sort of incorporate it into the composition. So this sort of bulge would give the effect that the animal figures were in movement, sort of undulating. Here's another image. I think you could recognize them as bison. And again, you know, before this discovery, you know, people thought that humans during the prehistoric times would not have been capable of producing anything like this. You know, when you look at these images, the rendering of them really employs a mix, you know, a complex mix of naturalism, like we do recognize it as an animal, in this case a bison, but also abstraction, where they've simplified the form or used twisted perspective or used more expressive lines to communicate the form. The crossed hind legs here in this image of the bison creates the illusion that one bison is closer, this is what I'm referring to over here, to the viewer than the other. So again, maybe thinking about this notion of communicating depth. Um, this visual depth in the scene demonstrates a primitive form of perspective, which would have been considered very advanced for this time period, this idea of thinking about perspective and the illusion of it. Most of the paintings are located at a distant from the cave's entrance, and many of the chambers are not easily accessible. This placement, together with the enormous size and compelling grandeur of the painting, suggests that the remote chambers may have served as a sacred or ceremonial meeting place. The pigment used to paint Glasgow and other caves were derived from readily available materials. We talked about ochre, and they had access, depending on the minerals and even plant sources include red, yellow, black, brown, and violet. No brushes have been found, so it's so in all probability the broad black outlines were applied using um, mats of moss or hair, or even with chunks of raw color. Also, they appear to have maybe blown paint directly from the mouth through some sort of tube to kind of color and stain the images. Here's another image. I love this one. I love the way they really exaggerated the horns of the stag. Again, to give you some more theories, in recent years, there's also been new research suggesting that the paintings in the cave may have incorporated prehistoric star charts. Some historians argue that some of the non-figurative dots or clusters that you maybe see here with some of the figurative images correlate with the constellations, um, and they think this image too, the image on the left, according to one theory, the eye of the bull, the bird, and the man may represent the three stars Vega, Altair, and Deneb, commonly known as the summer triangle. So they think that maybe star charts and constellations were also sort of incorporated into these images. Some anthropologists and art historians also theorize that the paintings could be an account of past hunting success or could represent a mythical ritual in order to improve future hunting endeavors. I'm going to stop here, and we'll continue our unit on prehistorical art. In the next unit, we'll be looking at some sculptural or objects, and we'll, as well as some more cave paintings. In the other sections, I'm going to be going a little bit more faster. This cave that we looked at, there were so many different images to look at, and so it took a little bit longer to discuss. Um, so stay tuned.